Welcome back, and let me tell you, it feels good to be back. In case you missed it, Mojang took a bit of a break over the holidays, but right before they did, they left us with a brand new update. Not a snapshot, not a pre-release, but an actual official update. Update 1.19.3 for Minecraft's Java edition. Now, this latest update was released on December 7th, 2022, so many of you may already be aware of some of the changes, but I still wanted to take a moment to cover all of these changes in detail before jumping back into some of the new and exciting snapshots that Mojang just started releasing. That way I can do my part in making sure that there is plenty of transparency over what is currently in the game as we move forward. And it's pretty dense, so we're going to have a lot to cover in this video. But before we dive into these features, I do want to create a bit of clarity around what is and is not included in this update and how it all relates to the much larger 1.20 update that's scheduled to release sometime this year in 2023. If you'll remember, back during the release of the very first snapshot for this update, Mojang mentioned that going forward, Java Edition would begin releasing multiple minor updates each year, which includes lots of content and small improvements that are ready to ship, as opposed to holding off and waiting for the next major update to release them. In contrast, those major updates that normally have a theme attached to them, like the Nether update, Caves and Cliffs, or the latest Wild update, they'll continue to release yearly on a longer timescale. And it's these larger updates, like the upcoming 1.20 update, whose name has not yet been revealed, that often include a significant number of new gameplay features and improvements that really change the foundation of the game in a more substantial way. Whereas minor updates are much smaller in nature relative to these major updates. Relative, of course, being the key word here because this update is actually pretty large. For quick reference, major updates are indicated by changes to that second octet, like update 1.16, 17 and 18, 19, and of course, 20, while minor updates are indicated by the third octet, like the current 1.19.3, which we tend to refer to as dot releases. So if you're ever confused about whether a current update is major or minor, this is a pretty good way to identify them. Now, with all of that being said, the major 1.20 features showcased at Minecraft Live, like the camel, chiseled bookshelves, hanging signs, and the bamboo wood, those are all part of the upcoming 1.20 update, so they're actually not included in this update. Technically, that is, because they will still be available through experimental data packs, but we'll cover more on that later. Instead, this update includes a long list of new quality of life features and changes to existing features that have been heavily influenced by player feedback over the last few years. So let's not waste any more time. Let's jump right into it, starting with the new default player skins. For over a decade now, unless you had a custom skin and access to the internet, players have really only had two default skins to choose from, Steve and Alex. And if you lost connection to the internet, you'd be stuck with choosing between these two. But now, more than 10 years later, we have 7 more skins to choose from. Noor, Sunny, Ari, Zuri, McKenna, Kai, and Efe. Which means we finally have a pretty good diversity of characters to choose from for those that don't yet have a custom skin or just don't have access to the internet. This is a great addition to the game, and quite frankly, it is long overdue, so I'm really happy with this one. Now, as soon as we launch the game, if we jump into the Options tab and head over to the Accessibility settings, we'll actually see a brand new Panorama scroll speed toggle. This toggle controls how fast that background panorama on the home screen will rotate. At 100%, it's at its normal speed, which is what we're used to. But if you wanted to slow it down for whatever reason, we now have that option. We could even bring it to a complete stop if we really wanted to. Moving into the game, let's begin with one of my favorite new changes to the Vex. This release gives the Vex a complete makeover, and it is a night and day difference to its previous model. Let's be honest, the old model of the Vex was pretty outdated. It had this odd looking humanoid shape, kind of like the player model had been shrunk down to a much smaller scale. And even the pixels were scaled down to allow for that same amount of detail that you'd see in a player skin, which I guess makes sense if your priority is to cram as much detail as possible into a mob's texture, but that's pretty inconsistent with the texturing and modeling of other mobs in the game, and also doesn't really fit that pixel art model that really defines Minecraft as a game. The new model, on the other hand, works beautifully. The pixels have been scaled up, the design looks clean, and the model has been completely reshaped to fit a more modern approach to Minecraft's mob design. Overall, I think it looks really good, and when we compare it side by side with an LA, we can also see that they have a very similar look to each other, which to me kind of adds this impression that perhaps these mobs are somehow related. Maybe the Vex is a corrupted LA, or maybe the LA is a reformed Vex. I don't know, but I like the potential lore that this adds to the game. I like when features like this allow the player base to be creative with the origin story of these creatures. After all, this is a sandbox game, so it's up to the player base to decide for themselves where these creatures came from. And of course, if we look really closely, we can also see that the Vex, although its model is smaller than before, still contains its old, slightly oversized hitbox, which is by design to make it easier to fight. The next major improvement comes to the creative inventory, which, if you've been following along, is something that they've been slowly tweaking in virtually every snapshot leading up to this update. So a lot of thought, feedback, and work has clearly been made to improving this inventory. To start us off, the tabs themselves have been completely reworked, to the extent that you probably wouldn't even recognize them from the old inventory, given that most tabs have either been renamed or collapsed into others and given new iconic visuals to suit them better. Some tabs have been completely removed, and others are brand new. For example, they completely removed the transportation tab, the miscellaneous tab, and also the brewing tab. And they added new tabs like the functional blocks tab, a spawn eggs tab, and even a brand new colored blocks tab that contains all blocks with 16 color variants. And the best part of these changes is that each tab is pretty self-explanatory now. So when you hover over a tab, the name and icon should make it significantly easier to find what you're looking for. And it goes beyond just the new ordering of the tabs. The blocks and items themselves have also been moved into categories that fit them much better to make the overall experience of finding relevant blocks much easier and far more intuitive. And my favorite part here is actually the addition of including several items that fit more than one category into more than one tab. So what I mean by that is, if a block like, say, the oak log makes sense being in the building blocks tab, but also makes sense in the natural blocks tab because it's found in nature, it can be placed in both to help you find it more easily. And this is also what makes tabs like the colored blocks tab possible, because you can have items like beds, candles, and banners included that have 16 color variants, while also having these items listed in the functional blocks tab. It's perfect. It solves so many problems with trying to decide where to put certain items throughout the creative inventory. Now Mojang is no longer restricted to choosing one tab for an item that might make sense in two different places. Now, within each tab, blocks are also now ordered by their material whenever it's possible. So, for example, all spruce blocks and their variants are now going to be next to each other, as well as all stone block variants, all deep slate variants, and so forth. And this makes it much easier to find and work with a palette of blocks of a specific kind, which is more often than not how most people work with blocks in this game, which is going to really help players find what they're looking for. Now, if we move over to the search tab, it will now list items sequentially grouped by the order of the other tabs. So for example, items found in the building blocks tab should always appear before items in, say, the redstone blocks tab. But overall, we can clearly see that the entire organization of the creative inventory has been heavily changed. And in my opinion, just from what I've seen so far, I think this is going to be for the better. Now, in addition to these organizational changes, one item has actually been completely removed, and a bunch of other items have actually been added that were previously only accessible via commands. The item that was removed is the petrified oak slab, so it can now only be accessed via commands. And honestly, I don't think a lot of people even knew that this existed, and I don't even really know how it's used, so I'm perfectly okay with this. The items that were added include the dragon egg, the ominous banner, the monster spawner, which we'll come back to, all of the suspicious stews, and all 3 flight durations of fireworks. And with those last 2, the tooltip will actually show the stew's effect while it's still in the inventory, as well as the flight duration of each rocket, which is pretty helpful. And finally, there is one additional tab with a whole suite of new blocks that is hidden by default. So, as long as you have the required operator permissions, if you make your way to the controls menu, you'll now find a new toggle for the operator items tab. And if you switch this on, a new tab known as the Operator Utilities tab will appear with a range of operator blocks that were previously hidden behind commands. Now, I won't go into the specifics here about how each of these blocks work, but they're essentially blocks that creative players can use to manipulate their worlds with commands, generate structures, create boundaries or invisible light sources, and even manipulate the state of other blocks. So now, we have quick and easy access to them right from the creative inventory. There have also been several changes made to tooltips, so while we're still in the creative inventory, we can see that tooltips for items that are outside of single category tabs, like here in my hotbar for example, now show categories where this item can be found. So if I need to know where items that are currently in my hotbar can be found within the creative inventory, it'll show the name of the tab or tabs where the item can be found listed in blue text. And previously, this feature was only available in the search tab. Now, in some cases, there are also tooltips available under options in the game menu. So if we make our way to the video settings, for example, some of the buttons provide a bit of extra information about what those options do in the form of a descriptive tooltip. And now, when navigating through these buttons with the tab key, those tooltips will be displayed either above or below them. And when hovering over each button with your cursor, the tooltip will be displayed right next to the cursor and will follow the cursor around. And a quick note, when a button in the menu has been selected via tabbing, and is currently in focus, it'll take priority over your cursor and will remain in focus until tabbing it out of focus. Alright, so also included in this update, of course, are the changes to the spawner, which has been renamed and is now called the monster spawner. As previously mentioned, the big part here is that this block has now been added directly to the creative menu for easy access, and its tooltip now actually shows the player how to use it, just in case you are new to using monster spawners. So if we place one down, the first thing we should notice is that it no longer has a default mob spawn attached to it. Previously, when you placed a spawner down, by default, it would automatically be set to a pig spawner and would almost immediately begin spawning pigs. But now, when we place one down, it will be a blank slate and it won't emit any of those fiery particles that active spawners tend to have. And of course, to activate it, all you need to do is right click on it with a spawn egg, just as the tooltip says. The pick block feature now works for spawner blocks as well, so if you press down on the scroll wheel on your mouse while having your cursor pointed at the spawner, it'll add the spawner to your inventory when you're in creative mode. And if you hold control while doing this with a spawner that is active, you'll acquire a unique monster spawner with the NBT data for that mob type attached, making it much easier to place multiple spawners of a specific type down. It essentially allows you to copy and paste a specific spawner without having to manually set each one up, which is a real time saver. While we're on the subject of mob spawning, I should also mention that there are 4 new spawn eggs that have been added to the game as well. For the Iron Golem, the Snow Golem, the Wither, and the Ender Dragon. Now, those first two, the Iron Golem and the Snow Golem, will be accessible right from the new Spawn Eggs tab in the Creative inventory. And these are really significant changes. Being able to spawn in a bunch of Iron Golems when needed instead of building them manually is hands down a huge quality of life change. But those last 2 eggs, for the Ender Dragon and the Wither, they're only going to be available through commands. And the obvious reason for this is to make sure that players who may not know what they're doing don't accidentally spawn in something like a Wither or a Dragon that then destroys their world. There's really no way to undo that. So even though we have access to these eggs now, we'll still have to use a command to get them. And they also changed the color of the polar bear spawn egg to try and distinguish it from the ghast spawn egg. I guess apparently they just looked too identical before. And mob spawning has also had some pretty big changes in the Nether as well. So in the Nether dimension, Endermen, skeletons, and Wither skeletons specifically used to spawn at light levels of 11 and below, but they'll now only spawn at a light level of 7 and below. And the main reason for this change was to nerf existing portal-based mob farms. Essentially, Nether portals themselves emit a light level of 11, so many overpowered farms in Minecraft have exploited these spawning mechanics to their advantage in order to instantly bring these mobs into the overworld, given that under the right conditions, they would spawn directly within or near the portal. It's still hard to say how much of an impact this will have on spawning rates in the Nether, but so far, after doing some testing, I haven't really noticed much of a difference, so we'll just have to wait and see. There have also been changes to the way some blocks provide support to other blocks in the game. For example, fence gates will no longer provide center support beneath them like they used to, which was always a bit strange to me that they even did this to begin with, so I feel like this is more of a bug fix than a feature. And also, blocks that require support that are attached to shulker boxes will now pop off when opening said shulker box. This only applies specifically to one of the 5 opened faces of the box, and not the base of the shulker box itself. And this also means that these blocks that require support also can't be attached to one of the faces while the shulker box is currently opened. Pretty straightforward. Now, according to the changelog, shulker boxes should also not be able to open if they're being blocked by a big drip leaf, a small drip leaf, a spore blossom when placed horizontally, or by a coral or coral fans. But when I tested this, only one of the 4 didn't open, so I'm not really sure if these are bugs that are still a work in progress. Moving on, when it comes to Strongholds, their placement code has been slightly modified to be a little bit more efficient. And they mentioned in the changelog that this will likely cause stronghold positions to shift ever so slightly from where you currently expect to find them. They'll still be placed in concentric rings around your initial spawn point, like normal, but their positions within those rings may change by a few degrees. Nothing too major, but it's still something to be aware of. A number of new unique sounds have now been added for various wood types when placed, broken, used, or walked on. And this includes a set of new sounds for 3 different types of wood, including overworld wood types like oak, spruce, and birch, nether wood types like crimson and warped wood, and even for bamboo wood, but only when it's been enabled by experimental data packs. But remember, for all intents and purposes, since bamboo is technically not included in this update, these new sounds for now only apply to the overworld and the nether wood types. And apparently, step sounds can now be heard when walking on carpets, lily pads, and small amethyst buds, as well as when walking through nether sprouts, glow lichen, crimson roots, and warped roots. In the previous Wild update, 3 new songs were added to the game: Firebugs, Airy, and Labyrinthine, as well as a new music disc. And relative to some of the other music in the game, for whatever reason, I guess this music was just a little bit louder, which I never really noticed before. So they've also tweaked the Wild update music to be slightly less loud than it was before. Improvements have also been made to the Open to Land screen. So if you're in a single player world and you open up the game menu, the Open to Land button will take you to a screen where you can open up your server to a local network so others nearby can join your world. And now, there's an option that allows the player to enter a custom port number for the server that is hosting the new LAN world, as opposed to it being generated for you automatically. And both the game mode and allow cheat buttons will also now be set to the default values of the world that you're currently in, which you can then change if needed. This of course means that the publish command, which is used to do the same thing through commands instead of the game menu, has also been updated so that you can add a custom port number to the end of the command. Additionally, the Realms News button has also been slightly tweaked so that when selected, it will now show a confirmation screen before opening the link, just in case you selected it on accident and need a way to say, never mind, please don't open the link in another window. And then, there have also been several changes made to chat, including removing the chat preview, as well as making it so that when messages in chat have been deleted by a server moderator, those messages will no longer be completely hidden. Instead, they'll be replaced with some text that says, "This chat message has been deleted by the server." And then the deleted message will remain in the chat window for at least 3 seconds before disappearing. Also, chat trust status indicators have also been tweaked. And partially filtered chat messages will now show the filtered text as gray hashes, with a hover text saying that it was filtered. Also, the chat reporting screen now shows when the player who is currently being reported rejoined the chat. And this brings us to the newly added draft player reports, which gives players the ability to have a draft of their report when reporting other players for inappropriate behavior. Essentially, as long as you're connected to the server, this feature automatically creates a draft of the player report that's being made, so that you always have the ability to go back to it just in case you accidentally exited the player reporting screen while in the middle of writing a report. Or in case for whatever reason the screen was forcibly closed, like if the player died while writing the report. Regardless of what happens, the draft report will continue to exist until the player leaves the current server or the world. And when leaving the game, the player will be given the opportunity to either discard or finish and send the report if they hadn't already done so. And finally, the teleport to team member option within the spectator menu now only shows up for teams with viable target players. Alright, let's move on to the numerous technical changes included in this update, beginning with the very exciting new game rules. This update includes a ton of new game rules that will potentially reinvent the way you play the game. First up, we have a few new game rules that control the drop rate of blocks and items that are blown up from various explosions. There are 3 game rules in total: the block explosion drop decay, the mob explosion drop decay, and the TNT explosion drop decay, each of which you can set to either true or false. When any of these game rules are set to false, all of the blocks affected by the explosion are going to drop, meaning that nothing will be lost or destroyed. Whereas if they're set to true, each affected block will have a random chance of either dropping as loot or being completely destroyed depending on how far away they were from the center of the explosion. By default, the TNT game rule is set to false, so that when you blow something up with TNT, nothing is destroyed, which means you could effectively use it to gather resources if you wanted to, without worrying about destroying the resources, so long as you don't use more than 1 TNT at a time. But for the other 2 game rules, they're set to true by default, which is half the reason why creeper explosions are so annoying to deal with, because they actually destroy many of the blocks around them when they blow up, making the process of filling in the crater that they leave behind very difficult, considering that you would need all of those destroyed materials to refill that hole. So, with these new game rules, you can now decide whether or not that should be the case by simply changing the game rule to either true or false, as you see fit. We also have the snow accumulation height game rule being added that determines the maximum number of layers that can accumulate on the surface of a block when it's snowing. By default, when it snows in the game, a single layer of snow will form on any exposed block, so long as there's open sky above it. But with this new game rule, we have a few more options. We can actually change the value to 0 to completely stop snow from forming altogether, giving the player more control over where snow should and shouldn't be without the weather affecting your surroundings. Or we can set it to any positive integer up to 8 in order to have snow layers accumulate over time, eventually adding up to a full block of snow, adding a lot more natural variety to the surrounding landscape, which is really neat. But wait, there is still more. We also have the water source conversion and lava source conversion game rules being added that controls whether or not new sources of these fluids are going to form or not. When either is set to true, a new source of that fluid will form in an empty block space when two adjacent spaces are filled. And if set to false, new sources will not form. As most of us are probably familiar at this point, by default, water is set to true and lava is set to false, making infinite water sources possible while lava remains a limited resource. But of course, if you wanted infinite lava to exist in your world, you can easily change that now by setting the lava source conversion game rule to true. And finally, we have the global sound events game rule that controls whether or not specific gameplay moments are heard by all players on the server, regardless of where they are. Spawning a wither in the game is a really good example of this, as when a player summons one into the world, everyone on the server can hear its chilling sound, even if they're in another dimension. Which means that by default, this game rule is set to true. But if you don't want to annoy your server mates every time you summon a wither, you could reset this game rule to false. Okay, so there are also 3 new notable changes to commands in this update as well, including a new fill biome command, a new execute subcommand, as well as improvements to the publish command. The fill biome command is actually completely new, giving the player the ability to change the biome data for a specified area. Using this command will take an entire area of your choosing and allow you to change that area to a new biome. Note that this doesn't change the generation of the environment itself, rather it changes the data for the area, making the game think that the area that was once a jungle biome, for example, is now a desert biome, changing the appearance of the area and some of its functionality. In this example, it makes a jungle look far less lush than it did previously, as we can see in the dried coloration of the leaves and the grass. The syntax for this command is as follows. Following the fill biome command, we'll include the coordinates for 2 opposite corners of the square area that we wish to fill, followed by the name of the biome that we're changing it to, and then we can also specify if we only want the new biome to replace an existing biome within that specified area, leaving everything else alone, although this is optional. Now, the execute command, which is a slightly more advanced command in Minecraft that we won't go into too much detail here, has been given a new subcommand that gives the player the ability to use execute commands conditionally based on whether an entity is in a specific biome. Essentially, from what I understand, the execute command itself provides the player a way to run a command across a wide range of entities based on any number of conditional criteria that must be met for that command to run. So really, the addition of more subcommands means more control for all the technical players out there. And finally, the publish command, which allows the player to open up their server to a local network instead of through the main menu, as we covered earlier, has also been improved so that you can add a custom port number to the end of the command. Alright, let's move on from game rules and commands and cover some changes to the Enderman. The loot tables for Enderman have now been adjusted to include a wider range of blocks that the Enderman could potentially be carrying when killed. Now, it's already the case that Endermen will drop many of the common blocks that they carry when they die, like dirt, stone, or even grass blocks. But there have also been several bugs reported regarding some of the blocks and items that they don't drop when they're killed. For example, when holding powder snow, they would actually drop a bucket of powder snow when they were killed. Or when holding potted plants, they wouldn't drop anything at all. However, now they'll drop both the plant and the pot when they're killed. Or when holding a cake with a candle, which I didn't even know that they could do, When killed, they wouldn't drop anything at all. But now they'll drop the candle, but not the cake because cake cannot actually be picked up as an entity in this game. And when holding a big drip leaf, they wouldn't drop it either when killed, and now they will. Now, this next change is actually a pretty big one, and includes new telemetry events that dictate how Mojang is going to collect your game-related data when you play Minecraft. I'm going to try to summarize this as best as I can, but I'd highly recommend reading up on more of the specifics in the changelog if this is an important subject to you. So there are two different sets of events that we need to take note of. This includes the world unloaded and world loaded events, both of which are required events, as well as performance metrics and world load times events, which will be optional. And really, for context, the reason these data collection events are being added is so that Mojang can better understand how Minecraft is being played, so that in theory, they can focus future game updates and improvements on the areas that are most relevant to how you play the game. Now, there are obviously several ways that they can do this, most importantly player feedback or experimental snapshots for example, but this is meant to be yet another tool that they can use to gather some analytics to try and improve the game as well. Now, with all of that said, the data that Mojang is collecting is actually fairly straightforward. So let's start with the required telemetry events. Data from the world loaded event is sent when a world is launched, and data from the world unloaded event is sent when a world is shut down. Pretty straightforward. Together, these two paired events calculate things like how long the world session has lasted, what game mode you were playing in, what version of the game you were playing in, as well as the modded status of the server. Again, all of which is to determine how you play the game. But the rest of the data collection events are optional, which means that you'll be able to choose whether or not you want the rest of this data to be sent to Mojang or not. More on that in a second. The performance metrics event will essentially be used to measure the overall performance of the game, focusing on metrics like your frame rate, rendering performance, memory usage, your PC's operating system, the version of the game that you're playing, and also the modded status of the server. And again, all of this is meant to help Mojang optimize the performance of the game for everyone who plays across a wide range of computer specifications and operating systems. And finally, the world load times event will be used to measure how long it takes to join a world, and how that changes over time when new features or technical changes are added, taking into consideration things like whether or not it's an old world or a new world being created for the first time, as well as, again, the version of the game and the operating system that you're playing on. Now, for transparency, all of this information is available to you right from the main menu of the game, and this is where you'll be given the ability to opt in or out of those optional telemetry events. So, from the options menu, you'll now find a new telemetry data button. Clicking on it will take you to the telemetry data collection screen that displays all of the information about what type of data is being sent to Mojang. And it's here that you'll be able to decide what information you want to be sent. By default, data collection is set to minimal, so that only the required data from world loaded and world unloaded will be sent. This way, if you were unaware of all these events being added, only the bare minimum would be sent. And it's only by switching this option to all that the rest of the optional data will be sent. And for me, I didn't feel like this data collection was really too intrusive. I thought it was actually pretty straightforward, so I went ahead and chose all for myself. But you get to decide for yourself whether or not you want all this data to be sent or not. Now, I'm going to be honest here, the rest of the technical changes in this update are a little too technical for my understanding. So I'm just going to quickly read through them, and if any of these changes are important to you, you'll have to do a deeper dive than what I can provide here. Okay, so let's run through these. To start, they've added new entity subpredicates for specific entities in the game that have variants, including the axolotl, boat, fox, mushroom, painting, rabbit, horse, llama, villager, parrot, and tropical fish. A ton of resource packs improvements have been added, including some pretty extensive changes to texture loading and stitching that are meant to improve loading performances. A series of network protocol changes have been made that might be useful for those of you who host a server. Some changes have been made to the crafting book recipes and their field categories. And they migrated linear algebra types to Java OpenGL Math Library, JOML, which is essentially just a Java math library for OpenGL used by developers for rendering 3D applications, like Minecraft. And that pretty much wraps up most of the technical changes in this update, which brings us to the experimental features. These features are actually hard-coded into the game, but they're controlled by a set of newly added feature flags that allow you to enable or disable groups of game features through the use of data packs. Basically, this means that you will have the ability to add these features into your world if you choose, but they're technically not in the game yet, which means that by default, they're hidden and they have to be enabled through these built-in experimental data packs in order for them to appear in your world. These of course include features like the camel, bamboo wood, chiseled bookshelves, hanging signs, and bundles. Even features like the new piglin mob head and the interaction it and other mob heads have with note blocks to create ambient sounds that we explored in a previous snapshot. And if you're wondering why these features are hidden behind data packs rather than just being included in this update itself, it's because these features are still a work in progress. Basically, Mojang is still working on them for the upcoming 1.20 update. They haven't been optimized for performance, they may still have several unresolved bugs, and because they're not ready for release, there's always a risk that they could potentially corrupt and break your world if enabled. So they're really only there so players like you can create experimental worlds to test these features and provide feedback along the way. With that being said, to enable these features, you can only do so when creating a new world. Once a world is created, there's no way to toggle these experimental features for existing worlds, which is by design so that you don't accidentally destroy an existing world that you've had for years. So when you go to create a new world, there should be a data packs button, and upon clicking it, you're going to see 2 new data packs available to you. And all you need to do is select each of them, hit done, proceed once you've read the disclaimer on how these features may break your world, and then create the new world. And that's it, pretty straightforward. You'll see as well that once the world has been created, when you go to play a selected world, it'll be marked in yellow text as experimental to indicate that this world contains experimental features. And finally, it wouldn't be an official update without a round of bug fixes. This release has over 200 bugs that were fixed, so there is no way that I'm going to possibly cover them all. Instead, I'm going to do a quick lightning round and list off all the bug fixes that I personally found most noteworthy. So here we go. Horses no longer suffocate when going through nether portals. Mobs will no longer build up fall damage when dangling on a lead. Sprinting will now be cancelled when dismounting rideable entities while sprinting. The direction of the damage being blocked by shields has been fixed. Explosions from end crystals, gassed fireballs, beds, and respawn anchors can now be blocked by shields. Rabbits will now always drop either raw or cooked food when killed. Water buckets can now be properly emptied into waterlogged blocks. When destroying a block of tall seagrass, the space that it leaves behind will now be filled with water rather than air. Holding the Q key on your keyboard will allow you to drop items rapidly from container inventories. Turtles will now have a 5-minute breeding delay before you can breed them again. Splash water bottles and lingering water bottles will now extinguish mobs and players that are on fire. And going into water while in a boat will also extinguish a player on fire. Mobs will no longer spawn on scaffolding or chorus flowers. Villager pathfinding in water has been fixed. The knowledge book texture within the crafting UI has been updated. The working subtitles for the cleric, weaponsmith, and armorer have been updated for consistency with other professions. The subtitles for an Enderman's angry screaming sound has been updated to differ from its idle sound. Donkeys, mules, and undead horses can now be saddled by right-clicking on them. Horse armor and carpets can be equipped onto horses and llamas by right-clicking on them as well. You can no longer set your spawn point inside of an end portal, which would cause the player to become infinitely stuck in the end. Creepers can now be ignited with a fire charge. The eye levels of piglins, zombified piglins, and piglin brutes are now consistent with one another. Melons can no longer generate underwater in jungles. The Alay's wings are now properly attached to its body, and its texture should now render correctly. The Alay will no longer render too low in boats and minecarts, and can now be interacted with while inside a boat or minecart. Allays will no longer attempt to pathfind to items that are outside of the world border. Allays will no longer hesitate before following, throwing items, or performing other actions. The Allay will now only pick up arrow and potion items that match the ones that they're holding. The Allay's dancing animation and held item positioning has now been fixed. And the Allay will no longer dance while panicking or when it's been summoned with no AI. Frogs will no longer fall into deep holes when pathfinding to entities. And they'll no longer fail to long jump to small blocks. The frog's walking animation will no longer be slowed down when affected by slow falling. Bees will no longer get stuck on non-full blocks. They'll no longer freeze and fall near certain blocks. And their pathfinding system will no longer cause performance issues. Breeding a screaming goat and a regular goat will now have a chance of producing a screaming goat. Nether portals are now able to replace snow layers when they generate in a snowy biome. Endermen will now take water damage when they are in a boat in the water. Copper ore will no longer generate in abundance in the deep dark, the way they do in dripstone caves. The behind-the-scenes counter for Skull Shriekers will no longer reset to 0 when entering or exiting the end portal, or when the player dies. And the following splash text can now be found on the main menu. And believe it or not, that is finally everything included in this latest release. And I gotta say, if this is how big minor updates are gonna be moving forward, I can't imagine how much content is gonna be in the 1.20 update. I mean, this has been quite the extensive update, and even though it didn't include all those big feature items that we're all most looking forward to, it still included a lot of quality of life changes that the community has been asking for a very long time now. Which I consider to be really great news because it means that Mojang is paying attention. And this has me really excited for the possible direction that they're taking this game. In any case, with all of that being said, I do really hope you enjoyed this latest release. This was a long one, so if you've made it this far into the video, that is incredible. Thank you so much, that means a lot. Really, there is so much to cover in these updates, and I really just want to be as thorough as possible for you all. Anyway, as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time.